So we know that rendering and lighting is important. We know it's potentially complicated, complex. Let's look at how we might go about actually doing it. How we go about actually making forms and things that we want to draw appear as if they're three-dimensional and are being lit by different types of light. A really kind of time-honored tradition, what way of sort of figuring this out and explaining and sort of drilling lighting so that you can sort of get control of it from a technical aspect is to kind of do some very, very, very simple rendering exercises. And what we do is we render a series of geometric shapes. And, the easiest place to start is with a cube. This doesn't necessarily mean that, perspective plays a part in this, but for the moment, I want to kind of try and let perspective take a back seat. So either use some of the templates that are here that are pre-made, or just kind of render them by hand. And I want to make a distinction between sort of rendering and perspective. So rendering is really important, but it's really just kind of a study of light. And what you probably find is that if I was to draw this box poorly in perspective, and if I was to cast the shadows kind of have to be kind of worked out in perspective, and we'll cover kind of how to do that. But if you kind of draw this box poorly, but you render it really well, what it'll look like is a really well rendered but kind of poorly drawn box. It'll be a bit wonky, but it might just look like, oh, it's kind of a wonky box. It's made out of something that's not, sort of precise metal or plastic or something. So we'll cover a range of different ways to actually apply lighting, and because there's different ways to do it. Some more technical than others, some more sort of painterly than others. But the basic principles are the same, and we can see those principles play out on these kind of planar surfaces with this sort of geometric perspective stuff happening. This is a really good way to just understand it, because it's a very simple sort of grid we've got. It's a very simple sort of toolbox, sandbox, to play with and just kind of see what happens. What happens if I move the light here? What happens if I do this? What's going to happen if I change the lighting in this way or add this extra complexity? The box is very simple. The box stays the same, but there's an infinite array of different lighting scenarios we can put the box under, different materials we can apply to a box or a sphere or other simple geometric forms. And that's really what we're doing here. And again, this is it is a technical exercise, but it's important to understand that and this is one of those things where you really just have to take my word for it, that these simple concepts really do play into actual drawing. They just do. And certainly anyone who can sort of render people and environments or fantasy environments really well has kind of done at least a little bit of this, and probably a lot of kind of just rendering basic cubes, or definitely they'll be thinking about all the concepts that we're talking about here. So it is a box, but as we'll talk about in the future, and as you hear about a lot, I'm sure, all things are kind of built out of simple geometric forms, and it's really just an extrapolation of, in the same way perspective is an extrapolation of simple rules, and this lighting is an extrapolation of simple rules. Like complex forms are simply simple forms combined. So this stuff is really important, and I want you to try as much as you can to really get into it and kind of have fun with it, and know that if you can do this well, it will definitely parlay into every other aspect of your art. So there's a couple of sort of things that really combine to create sort of lighting that is kind of working. And the first one is kind of shadow casting, which if we're kind of rendering from a particular light source, we have to consider that you know, an object is going to cast a shadow, because where an object comes in front of a light source, we kind of, light doesn't get behind it, because the light rays are kind of bouncing. They're not kind of able to hit the area where the shadow is. The shadow is kind of where an object is blocking certain things in it from receiving light. So if there's no light, there's no form, and we get darkness. So it's important to kind of think about, if we've got like a simple box, where have I got? So here's a simple box, and this red line here is a sort of rough guide for the shadow casting. And the way that the shadows are figured out, and we'll just cover this quickly because there'll be also a slightly more in-depth breakout from this, just a separate tutorial that will cover this, so you don't have to scroll back and find this in the video. But the basic idea is that, and it's not too hard to sort of visualize, but if we have our object, we've got a box here, and we have there's different ways we can have a light source. We can have a light source over here, right? And this is kind of like lighting the object, but in this case, it's kind of not, it's a local light source. Local light source means basically not the sun. It's a light source that is kind of close to the object, like a lamp, or basically any kind of light that is not the sun, or is not a really diffuse kind of like massive array of lights or something. It's like a torch or something like that. So this is a light that we want to place in space, and the way we do that is by putting it sort of on the grid. So if we get the grid, you can see this is how this was made, and basically what's happening is that we're visualizing the light in three-dimensional space, and it's got a point on the ground where it's kind of grounded. And what we do is we basically consider 2 points, and so for instance we have this point, and this red line here is actually being constructed from a different light source, which I'll talk about later. But say we've got this face of the box, and you can consider this as kind of, I've heard it often explained as like a post, or kind of like a stick. And this is something that really makes it easy to understand kind of what's going on. But the light is kind of traveling down here. Let's grab a line. So the light is kind of traveling in this direction, because that's where the light is. And what it's doing is it's kind of, there'll be, obviously this side of the box will be kind of in shadow. And if we also consider this line, which is kind of taken from the bottom on the ground plane, this is what actually locates the three-dimensional light in space. Otherwise, it could be kind of really far in the distance, or it could be like really sort of close to us. It's hard to say how big or small that light would be. It's not really. It's just a point in space that defines where the light is. So. So we draw these two lines, basically. You've got a line which is the post for the light. You imagine a lamp is sitting on there, and then we've got an object, and we can sort of, take out these things and just consider this to be a simple sort of stick. And so if we do that for these other faces as well, and then we say, okay, light is always going to be sort of coming down, and it would be coming down everywhere, like all these little rays. They kind of look like perspective lines, but in fact they are sort of light rays. And this is where perspective really helps us to figure out a lot of these lighting issues, especially with geometric forms. And this is a good way to kind of explain it. Obviously, with more organic forms, these things become much more complicated. And then what we do is we consider that this is also going to kind of go and sort of splay out. And where these things intersect, this is where we've basically got some points which we can define our shadow with. So over here, you can see what's happening is we're creating a triangle here, and this is kind of an area which is in shadow. And we've got another triangle here, and this kind of space, this air in here is in shadow. And we've got another one. If we take this triangle here, this is in shadow. And also this one here. This stuff can get quite complicated if you've got a bunch of lines. So that's kind of what's going on, is this area here, because the light is coming down, this is in shadow. And subsequently, all the area in here, let's see if we can find a different color, all the areas kind of that outline this area, all of this stuff, and you kind of have to use your imagination because some of this stuff is behind the box. And this one we can kind of forget because it's actually going inside the box, so it doesn't really apply. But if we go out here, we've got this point, and if we trace this over here, so we've kind of got, if we go back and think about our sort of white, let's put this under here, we've got our white cube. Let's dial down the opacity of all those bright colors. So we've got this kind of this shape here, and this is what would be a cast shadow. And you can see that again, the light's coming down here. It's not meeting here, so these things are not receiving this light. And basically, we use this shadow casting to draw the cast shadow. So that's kind of how it's working. But this is for a light source, which is sort of local. So you can see the perspective in the same way if you think about those wide angle perspective grids, like we're getting quite a weird shadow, like a long shadow being cast here. So where you place the light, and if you think about this, if you just get a really good trick is to perhaps get, just search the internet for a paper box template. If you just type in paper box template, you can just print it out and make it with a glue stick, cut it out with scissors, old school style, and then just get like a little pen light or a torch and just kind of see what happens. It's the kind of thing that's very obvious, or just kind of think about, when the sun is really low on the horizon, we're getting these long shadows, and this is why, because the rays would be kind of getting cast here and creating these kind of long shadows. As opposed to if the sun was kind of straight ahead, you'd almost get no shadows because because there's lights just going straight down. So, but this is for a local light source, like something like a torch or something like that. What about one that is sort of just like the sun or something which is kind of much more diffuse? So there's ways of calculating sort of backlighting and front lighting with sun that we'll talk about later. But this is just a simple way to explain it. We're going to be using a side lighting. And what's happening is that we've got instead of our triangles being like kind of here, our triangles are sort of much larger, and they're tracing off to a different vanishing point, which is a lot sort of further away. So let's have a go at this. So we've got some lines here, And instead of these coming from a light source, which is here, they're just coming like way in the distance, because basically the sun is it's like 150 million kilometers away from us or something. So it's so far away that any light rays that it casts are kind of considered to be pretty much sort of parallel to each other. So if you think about, if we're thinking about sort of a top view of this box, and we've got kind of light coming this way, if we have a light and it's kind of from the sun, then all these rays are kind of parallel to each other and they're not converging. Whereas if we had over here, and again, this is top view, we had like a lamppost or something, all these light rays are kind of, they're not parallel. They're radiating out from this point, but the sun is, and the same thing's happening with the sun. I'm sure these would be sort of converging this way, but the sun is so far away that the convergence is irrelevant for our purposes, which is why the sun is kind of a different style of lighting to something which is local lighting. So basically, if we run this same thing with the sun, we've got lines going out sort of this way, and if you do it from the side, we can basically sort of say, well, these are kind of just going from left to right like this, and what you can do is just sort of draw a line down like this, and again, these lines are kind of just going to be parallel to each other because they're coming from the sun. So the sun is up there and somewhere to the side here, but because it's just kind of relatively flat, we're not gonna think about that too much. So again, this is one of those issues of perspective where we're simplifying things. We're simplifying points and perspective and how many vanishing points and stuff there are. So just so it's simpler, because basically the margins are so small in some cases that it's not going to make any difference if we simplify it in terms of how it looks, but it's going to make things a lot simpler. So we've got this simple shape here, and this is the cast shadow for this box if we think about sort of some light from the sun coming all the way there. Again, this is the box. So that's kind of how you would think about it, and don't worry too much if this is if it's kind of hard to kind of understand. It's the sort of thing that once you play with it, it makes a lot more sense. It's something you kind of got to do a few times and go like, oh, okay, and what happens if I move the light here? And what happens if you want to do this and that? How does it look? So, but yeah, just think of light rays basically, and think of objects blocking them. And really the unit of measure is this kind of triangle. That's what we're trying to describe. It's like an area where light is not getting, and that's our shadow. And again, shadow is important because shadow is going to show form, and without this light we basically have nothing. So let's take that one step further. Let's get rid of kind of all of this sort of technical stuff. If we have I've got, so here's a little, this is the one I'm going to use because it's going to look a bit more natural, right? Got some sunlight coming down. It's going to be less sort of dramatic. If we think about it, we just kind of got a box there, and it's kind of gray, so we don't have a lot of light. But let's think about the shadow. Let's think about sort of casting a shadow there. What we can do is I'm going to draw this underneath the box, and kind of and we'll talk about kind of how to pick different values and sort of figure out the technique of sort of, actually rendering this. But for the moment, it's just important to kind of just get a feeling for what's happening. Again, this kind of stuff might appear overly simple, or it might be sort of mind-blowing. It all depends whereabouts you're at. So we've got a cast shadow. We've got light coming down here. We've got an object, but the object kind of doesn't have any light on it. It's kind of this sort of gray. So let's think about making saying, okay, light is coming from this direction, and that means that the top surface is going to be lighter because that's getting light, and probably this side surface is going to be not quite as light as the top because it's receiving less light. Light's kind of hitting here more than here, and this side is kind of going to be in shadow. So again, we can make the top of it brighter. And we can make this one kind of sort of less bright. And that's kind of the basics of what we're doing with everything, is that we are changing the values of different sides of an object, and that helps us show form. And these value relationships are really the majority of what we're doing. And the first step is really just to define, you have an object and it's got different sides, and basically if all of those sides are the same, then it just looks like a flat shape. And it's only by defining different sides and different shapes, different sides of the shape, that we actually create form. And without this, we don't have any form. But you can see that if we sort of take away some of that construction, take away the grids. So this is a fairly simple sort of representation of a cube, right? It's a very mundane, flat sort of look. It doesn't look real, and this is a really good place to start. But it's still not real, right? And that's because, as we were talking about before, light kind of bounces everywhere. It's not just this concept of, okay, light's not getting to this object, and that's all. That's the end. It's in shadow. Because this ground around here, if we look at this, this ground here is sort of lit to a degree. It's more lit than this. This bit of the ground is in shadow. This bit is kind of lit. And what's going to happen is light's going to bounce off sort of here, and it's going to bounce on here. And this is basically the next level of complexity, is reflected light. Especially when it comes to painting, I think if you can all sort of understand just the fact that reflected light exists, then we'll be well on our way, because it's one of the major issues with art kind of looking flat and it not feeling like it's kind of a well-considered painting done by an experienced artist. That is often one of the differences, is that we kind of are not considering the concept of core light. So we'll come back to this cube in a bit, but I just want to kind of jump out and start to talk about the concept of reflected light and how it's really gonna help us in general. And I think it's much easier to kind of explain what's happening, and not just what's happening, but how reflected light is going to help us render things that are not cubes, because the cube is a very good way to explain it, and it's a very good way to practice it, because once we get into reflected light on a cube, you can do all sorts of interesting things, and it does become a sort of a worthwhile exercise. But let's just consider something like a cylinder, because a cylinder is much closer to maybe like an organic form, like an arm. And I'm just gonna make a very sort of simple graphical arm. But let's say this is kind of again, want to put a bit of actual drawing in here, so it's not all completely abstract. So if we have an actual arm, what's happening here is that the arm has a certain sort of value, like, it might be sort of skin value, and what we call that is local color. So the local color of these cubes that we're dealing with is kind of like, it's like a matte white, like a matte beige. And matte basically means non-reflective, or is the very low reflectivity, and so something which is shiny is kind of the opposite of matte. So we've got light maybe coming from this direction on just anything, like everything we draw. Okay, so what would happen is that this light would kind of be like revealed, but perhaps these other sides of it are going to be in shadow. And probably, like, again, this face of the arm is going to be getting a little bit more than this one, but they're quite similar. So we've got some we've got some basic lighting happening. But the trick really here is to understand what happens with the reflected lighting, because the number one trap that people fall into when it comes to rendering is that we consider rendering as kind of rendering a smooth surface. And the problem with that is that we want to render, and therefore we think about sort of shading, and it's like, oh, I need to shade, which means I need to go from dark to light, because dark to light is going to show that this form is round. And so we kind of go like this. So we kind of keep rendering more, and we go, well, this is kind of, this is a bit of a cylinder, and therefore we're going to get sort of an even distribution, and kind of halfway around the cylinder, we're going to kind of stop seeing light, and we'll start to see shadow, and we're going to make this as sort of gradual as possible, because it's a gradual, sort of cylinder, and we sort of keep going away with this. And this does make things look dimensional, because we've got value change going around here, right? So it's kind of light here, dark here. We've got value change. It looks like form. As I'm rendering this, you can see that something's happening, but it still looks flat. And the reason it still looks flat is basically because it just has highlight and shadow. And if you look around, and again, this is not always the case, but the way to give something more dimension than that, and you can really see this come into play if you look at any sort of photography or movie or anything like that. They go to great lengths to add as much sort of reflected bounce light, fill light, and other lights besides this kind of thing, because this just looks a little bit flat. It's kind of not quite flash photography, but it's getting there. So what happens, and the reason that we have a thing called core light is that, and the core light is basically in the middle, and I'll show you how that plays out in a second. So core light is kind of in the middle, and the reason something like core light happens, and I'm just kind of darkening this up so it'll make sense in a second. Is that we have a lit side here and we have a dark side here. But normally because of the way light's traveling, light is normally traveling sort of directly sort of past an object. And, if you're on the ground, or you're kind of, you're not sitting out in the middle of nowhere with no objects around you, often, there's going to be something kind of next to you, or, like a couple of meters away, like the ground, or like a wall, or something else, or whatever. And what will happen is that light will receive this light, because we'll get light rays bouncing off here, right? And sort of less off here a little bit, because the light is hitting it less directly. So if light hits a surface more directly, then it's more likely to kind of bounce light off. I think that's right, or it might just be that we see it more or something. I'm not entirely sure about the physics. Don't quote me or put that in your scientific thesis. But we've got this light, and this light's hitting here, which is lighting this up. But it's also passing behind, and it's passing in front and everywhere. And it's going to hit objects that are behind this object. Normally, again, if you're sitting near the ground or something, a couple of meters away. So if it's a fairly bright light, like the sun or something, what you're going to get is that then light bounces off the wall or the pavement or wherever, or the person standing next to you, and it bounces back, right? And then what happens is that this almost becomes a secondary light, because light is now coming from this direction. It's not becoming in the same directionality as like your main light source, but what's happening is that there's going to be light here. So we start to get this side of the form is going to be rendered up. Sorry, we're just going to get some lighting here, and so we're going to start to get some form change here because light is hitting this side of the object, and so you're going to get form. And what's left, right, is this thing called a core shadow. And you don't ever want to get, because this is your main light source, right? Here, this is your main lit face. It's rare that this object which light is bouncing off is going to be brighter and better at emitting light than your kind of main light, because this light is kind of traveling and is bouncing off. So it's going to be diminished. It's going to be less direct. So the reflected surfaces are almost always, and definitely if you're not sure exactly what lighting scenario you've got or whatever, but pretty much 99% of the time, they're going to be way less bright than any kind of light in the full light in the full sun. So we never want to make any sort of source of reflected light brighter or as bright than our main light source. That's just something which is really important, because that's also the second trip, is that people kind of go, oh, reflected light, okay, and then you kind of lose all your form. So form, and again, the reason that this is happening is because we're used to seeing it. We're used to seeing this in the world, and therefore we understand it. We understand form instinctively when it's built of these major building blocks, and those building blocks are your main light source. You've got your core shadow, and you've got your reflected light. Or it's often called bounce light because it's bouncing off things. So these are the main, these are the kind of fundamentals of lighting, kind of everyday objects, and you can really see them play out here because it's kind of this cylinder. I think cylinder is a really good way to understand it. And the reason that the core exists and it's such a thing is, if you think about kind of what's happening, maybe if we sort of take this from just kind of a cut out side view, if we consider this as kind of the arm, right? And we've got light is kind of coming here, right? And it's bouncing off here, and it's missing these bits. And there's kind of shadow here underneath, but these bits are kind of getting lit and bounced off, right? So we've got some light kind of getting around here, but because these faces are more sort of direct and opposite this light source on the ground, they're going to be kind of lit, because again, a major aspect of sort of lighting is that the more sort of perpendicular a surface is to the light, the more sort of the more light is directly hitting something, the more that light's going to affect it. That's just, again, I don't want to get into physics at that point, but that's a fundamental principle. So what happens is that this bit is lit up, right? We've got plenty of lighting here, and this is kind of in shadow, but we have some sort of light here, because these areas are kind of receiving light. And it's kind of down like towards here, maybe not so much, you know, might be a little bit. But because we've got this shadow here, this kind of might not be considered such a light source because it's going to be sort of dark. But around here, again, I'll just try and change colors, but around here, what you can see is that there might be other light sources in the environment, you know, that are bouncing light off things, but they're not going to be quite as close. And, you know, they might be as close, and that might change your lighting scenario. But in general, this concept is that often, you know, if you're just kind of sitting in the middle of nowhere, these faces here, where your core shadow is, are receiving less light than what's underneath them, because they're kind of facing the side, and the light is coming this way. So there's going to be a lot of light here, and there's going to be a lot of light here, because this is where light's bouncing off. But on the sides, they're kind of facing nothing. And that's why you get this concept of a core shadow. That's why it pops up so much. And that's why it really always helps to define form, to think about the core shadow. And the other thing with lighting that doesn't really apply to this geometric stuff, but is really important to understand, is that if this is a complex form, right? So you know, we're kind of tapering. The core shadow will actually be somewhat of a contour, and you know, if there was sort of biceps and things here, and I sort of drawn this in more detail, what you'd see is that the core shadow will kind of sort of trace a path that actually gives you a lot of information about form. It's almost a linear part of the drawing, linear being sort of a line. And what you see actually is when people do a lot of life drawing, they can often define much of the form simply by putting in the core shadow. So the core shadow is really a really important thing to consider, because it shows a lot of form just kind of where it is. Even though, again, the core shadow is not necessarily a thing, all these different aspects are part of lighting, but the core shadow, because of what it does, is really important. And we can think about these different aspects like main light, reflected light, and core shadow as being kind of separate constructs, even though really it's all light. But these are so important that it's important to kind of break them down and consider them. So yeah, if we look at kind of how to render that in a cylinder, what's happening is that it's just I'm going to do this quite roughly, because we'll have plenty of demos where it's kind of explained in detail. But if we sort of consider again, take sort of something like sort of this, you know, like maybe 70%, and then put some shading in. So we say light's coming from sort of here, this direction. Then probably this side of the face is going to be, it's not going to be completely in shadow. And let's see if I can just kind of make that a bit clearer. And what's going to happen is that the light is going to kind of, at some point, we're going to, along this cylinder, again, it depends sort of where and at what point. Where and what point often depends on perspective, but I'm not really going to figure this one out entirely. Let's get rid of some of these grids for a second. So got these different concepts, and probably it's actually important to put in some form of shadow underneath it, because one of the things is that our brain is used to seeing a lot of shadow underneath things, and if we don't see shadow underneath things, then again we're less likely to sort of recognize it as form. But what's happening here with reflected light is that it's bouncing off this surface here, and it's kind of bouncing here, so these areas are in shadow, and then this is going to bounce back up and lighten this up a little bit. So again, just doing it very roughly. Let's get rid of that for a sec. So in this case, we've only got sort of very simple value to define what's happening. So we've got reflected light under here, and this is what's going to give this a sense of sort of reality. But we're also going to get lots of other complicated things which are going to happen. So for instance, even though some objects might be matte, which means they're not reflective, you know, like a mirror is very reflective, something which is you know, not reflective like plastic or something like that is considered matte. So again, I don't think it's terribly important. We'll talk about kind of how to technically go about rendering stuff, but you can kind of use whatever tools you want, but we'll cover some different ones. But this is the concept of reflected light. We've got this is our main light. We've got, and then everything is in shadow, but we're receiving reflected light. Now, we'd also be receiving maybe a bit more reflected light kind of over here, because this shadow is going to reflect less light than what's over here. And there might be a small gradient, although it might again be kind of tricky to see, that goes up here. But this is the next step of sort of complexity, is we've got light source, we've got a shadow, and we've got some reflected light, which is kind of bouncing up, reflected light or bounce light. And the idea with these geometric cubes and sort of other shapes is to try and understand kind of, because we've got a fairly controlled environment to play in, is try and understand kind of how all these things play out and exactly what's happening. So I can keep rendering that, or I could render it in with a bit more intent. This is kind of just roughly showing what's going on. But that's the basic idea, is reflected light is light which is bouncing off a surface. And over here, you know, you might get sort of, you know, it's reflecting a bit more of this sort of shadow. It gets kind of infinitely complicated. And we'll go into some of that a bit later, the sort of the nitty-gritty of everything that can sort of reflect, because the other thing is that this is going to reflect into the environment a bit. So the surface that we're sitting on, to make it look real, to make it look more and more real, we just add an increasing level of complexity. So if we've got this concept of reflected light, let's go back to the cube and talk about kind of how we might start to render that, and how we might add that extra level of detail. So this time I'm going to use just a slightly different technique. I'm just going to use a big sort of airbrush, and because I've already got these different areas set up, and you can see at the moment it's kind of it kind of works all right. Let's adjust the values a bit. And so this is lit, this is unlit. And this one's kind of, it's a little bit in between. It's receiving more light than this back surface, but less light than this one. So it's going to be sort of somewhere in between. Again, I'll talk about the techniques of what I'm doing a little bit more, but it's important to just understand these concepts first. So you can see this, because of the way the lighting is set up, we've got a really good differentiation between these different planes, which is showing the form really well. And that's something that you always want to try and create. You know, if you're talking about like drawing the arm and redrawing the arm, you know, it's important to think about lighting and how it's best going to light your subject so it shows the best form, and, you know, so you're not flattening it out. So for instance, here we're talking about like this face. If if the light was maybe in a different position and it was making sort of this face slightly lighter, you can see that we're starting to flatten things out and we're seeing less form than we'd kind of like. And you know, if you've ever sort of done any photography or looked at sort of any, you know, movies behind the scenes, you'll understand the length that people will go to get good lighting setups is immense. That's a massive part of photography and cinematography, is just light and understanding light, managing it. There'll be people standing around with big bits of white cardboard to kind of bounce light into the scene so that someone's face is lighting up to either represent a different lighting scenario, like, you know, maybe it's later in the day, or they've got to make two shots look the same, whatever. It's, you know, and that's why often studio lighting, indoor lighting in sets and stuff is so important, so that, you know, that you can shoot all day and then you can have all the different shots next to each other appear as if it's like, you know, only a few seconds have passed, because they can control the light. Whereas if, you know, you shoot it in daylight, it can be a lot trickier because the lighting changes, you know, and, you know, if it takes an extra couple of hours to do one shot versus another shot, then you might be in trouble. But people go to a great degree to really fine-tune how light is running across forms and how it's going to show form the best. So if you're an artist, don't be afraid of going like, oh, well, you know, I don't want to change the light too much, because, you know, it's important to be realistic. And most photography and things which are considered real are extremely manipulated when it comes to light, including introducing light sources which don't exist. You know, often a camera setup will have, you know, 3 lights, 4 lights, and it'll have, light planes, bounce like umbrellas and stuff that are going to diffuse the light or focus the light, etc., etc., etc. So this is really important, because the better we can show form and we can show the difference between different planes of an object, and still have the lighting be looking good and realistic, then that's going to look the best. That's going to show the form, and that's going to give us that sense of dimension. So this top plane is kind of, you know, fairly evenly rendered. But let's think about these kind of side planes a bit. What's probably going to happen is that we're going to have a bit more bounce light is going to come here. So the top of this cube might be slightly darker than the bottom, because what's happening, you know, if we kind of make it all one color to kind of start with, what's going to happen is light's going to bounce off and it's going to come up and it's going to appear sort of around here somewhere. So that's going to give us a slightly more realistic look. And again, it can be quite subtle. But that's really important. And it's going to be the same over here. We're going to have a little bit of light kind of bouncing up there. But because again, we've got this black area here, probably this is going to be not just reflecting more light from down here, it's also going to be reflecting some black. So again, it's kind of overlaying of different thinking in terms of what's reflecting and how that's working. And you could probably calculate a lot of this and exactly what's happening, with extra perspective lines and extra grids and all that kind of stuff. But really, at some point, we're doing much more guessing and much more kind of just kind of using our eye to gauge sort of what's happening. So there might be some sort of stuff going on with the major sort of form. We could maybe give it a little bit of difference, just to kind of put a slight gradient on it. And you can see here what I've done is I put a little line here, and I did this earlier, just here, or else is it? Here we go, that one. And that's kind of just, we might not need it quite so much sort of down here, but because it's a much sharper edge, what it means is that it's going to catch the light. There's a lot more surfaces as this turns round, which are going to receive some kind of really full-on light. And generally that's just sort of something that happens, is like an edge will catch a bit more light. Maybe not as much as this. But yeah, it's important to understand that nothing is kind of completely flat like this. So that's kind of adding some simple reflected light. And really the trick is to just kind of play around with it and keep playing around with it. As we add reflected light to some different parts, you might see that other bits sort of need some extra reflected light, and we just kind of push it around. And that's, a lot of painting is observing these issues and sort of modifying them, just kind of tweaking it a bit. And this really, especially when we set it up like with layers like this, is really easy to kind of just add a bit here and add a bit there and kind of play around with it. But what's some other things we could consider? I mean, one would be that the shadow itself is going to receive more reflected light from different areas. So I'll just copy it and play around with it. So this is often you have like the edges of shadow can be a bit sort of fuzzy. Something that we sort of frequently see. Because right here, there's a lot more light. Like there's a lot more light here that's kind of going to invade this area, because light doesn't just bounce off sort of objects. It bounces off, bits and pieces of stuff in the air. We have sort of overall fill light and stuff which is going on. So it's important to look at that as well. Another thing that's happening, which we can consider, is that underneath objects, we might get also like, a stronger little cast shadow as well, which is going to be where light, we don't only have cast shadow, but we have a lot of light is having trouble getting in there. It doesn't matter where it's coming from or whatever. It might be a little bit darker than just kind of lower the opacity of that so it doesn't become too extreme. But, we're going to have a little bit of light there, which is going to give us more dimension. The other thing we can do is look at, maybe there might be a bit of light kind of, if we want to make this light kind of on a surface, there might be a bit of sort of light that's kind of bouncing down into the environment from the box. So the box might be emitting some light and creating some stuff happening there. And just the more that you think about this, and the other thing is that we can sort of create contrast and punch different areas up, or because nothing's flat. If something's flat, it really starts to look flat. Obviously, if there's no value change, then there's no form change, and we kind of imagine that, oh, that's all flat. And if something's flat, it's going to make everything sort of look flat. So imagine, oh, that maybe there's some gradients in the background that's going to add some complexity to things. But this is really the key to rendering, is just considering the form that we have and considering how value is going to modify that. So when we come back in part 2 of this techniques kind of explanation, I'll explain a bit more about how I've done what I've done here, and some more details, unpack a few more of these concepts and go over a bit more. But for now, this is the basics. This is kind of how we do lighting. We consider sort of an object and how light is affecting that, and a major part of how light affects that is where that object casts a shadow. Other really important aspects are the concept of reflected light. You've seen here, just adding reflected light has really given this cube a lot more sort of detail and reality than it had before. And the other concept, which is kind of, it's a bit abstract, but it really comes into play when you start to render actual characters and stuff, is the concept of core light. Is that reflected light really creates this weird sort of black area or darker area. Oh, where's our stuff? It kind of creates a dark area like right in the middle of a form. So instead of getting this standard sort of gradation where it's like, oh, this is a round form, it's going to go from light to dark, and it's going to be sort of halfway in between in the middle. It's not that way. It's halfway in between in the middle, and then it gets lighter, because we've often got light bouncing off objects behind an object and kind of lighting the underside of it. Or if the light is coming from the left, then we've got light kind of passing an object and lighting it from the right. Same kind of concept. But those are the basics. These are the things that we have to consider. And playing around with a box is a very good way to kind of just sort of understand how all these things interact. And the better you get at understanding these, basically the better your boxes will get, the more realistic they'll get, the more you understand how light affects objects, the better everything that you do will look. Because what we're dealing here with is very subtle changes, and subtle changes to a box are just as tricky to do as are subtle changes to like a full character that's got, like multiple light sources and some crazy thing going on. Just as important to understand what's happening here. And all you need to do, if you understand it in detail here, is just extrapolate it. And if you understand it here, it's easy to extrapolate it. You just kind of do more of it and go, oh, this light's coming from here and this is happening. So yeah, this is really the key. The more of this you can do, and the better you can make these boxes and simple geoforms, the better all your drawing and all your art will be.